A millionaire forces his son to marry a truck driver, but he couldn't have imagined the twist that would follow. The office of Arthur King was an unmistakable display of dominance. Every inch of the room was meticulously curated to project power. Walls lined with trophies from prestigious business awards, framed degrees from Ivy League universities, and antique furniture that exuded wealth. Everything about the space declared one thing: success achieved through ruthlessness and control. Sitting across from Arthur was his son, Lucas, a young man in his late 20s with tousled hair and a weary expression. He sat slouched in the leather chair, his arms crossed defiantly over his chest, eyes staring at the floor to avoid meeting his father's unyielding gaze. The tension was thick, each second of silence only amplifying the sense of confrontation. "Enough, Lucas." Arthur's voice sliced through the quiet, cold and commanding. There was no hint of hesitation. Your reckless spending, the parties, the utter disregard for responsibility, it ends now. Lucas let out a bitter laugh, lifting his gaze to meet his father's. The contempt in his eyes was unmistakable. "What are you going to do, Dad? Ground me? Cut off my allowance? Send me to my room without dessert?" The sarcasm was sharp, a habitual defense mechanism that barely masked the frustration beneath. Arthur did not flinch. He merely regarded his son with the same cool detachment he used in business negotiations, as though calculating how best to proceed. "No, Lucas," he said, his tone steady and calm, almost unnervingly so. "I'm going to fix you. It's time for you to get married." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Married? Lucas sat up straighter in the chair, his posture stiffening. His pulse quickened as he struggled to grasp the absurdity of what he had just heard. "Married?" he repeated, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it sound less ridiculous. "To whom exactly? And why do you think I'd ever agree to this?" Arthur's expression didn't waver. "Her name is Amber. She's a truck driver. Lives in Vermont." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as though the matter were already settled. "And yes, Lucas, you will marry her. It's not a request." The shock that surged through Lucas was immediately followed by a surge of anger, an instinctive rebellion. His hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly, knuckles turning white. "Are you serious? A truck driver? I've never even met this woman." He shook his head in disbelief. "And you think you can just dictate my life like this? What century are you living in, Dad?" Arthur's gaze was icy, his tone unyielding. "This isn't about love, Lucas. It's about discipline. About teaching you to find value in things beyond luxury and excess. You've had everything handed to you. It's time you learn what life is like without me cushioning your every fall." Lucas stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "So that's it then," he snapped. "You're just going to pawn me off to some random woman, as if I'm a chess piece you can move around at will? I'm not some asset you can restructure, Dad." Arthur's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something like disappointment. Or perhaps it was disdain. "You've been living like one," he replied, his voice as sharp as ever. "This is your only option. Either you agree to this marriage, or you can walk out that door and figure out how to survive without a penny of my money." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was different. There was no hesitation in Arthur's stance, no room for bargaining. Lucas could see it now. His father had already decided his fate, orchestrated this plan with the same meticulous precision he used in all his deals. There was no point in arguing. Arthur always found a way to get what he wanted. He always stayed one step ahead, laying traps Lucas never saw coming until he was already caught in them. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing as the weight of his father's ultimatum sank in. What kind of life was he being forced into? The very thought of marrying a complete stranger, especially someone from a world so different from his, felt like a bad joke. Yet, as he looked at Arthur, he saw no trace of humor in the man's expression. His father was dead serious. After a long moment, Lucas finally spoke, his voice low and laced with resentment. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Arthur inclined his head slightly. "Very. This is your wake-up call, Lucas. You're a grown man who acts like a boy. It's time to start acting like someone who understands responsibility." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they cut too close. Lucas knew his father's assessment wasn't without merit. He had lived a life of indulgence, free from consequence. But to marry someone he had never met, to be sent away to some remote place, as if he were being exiled, it was almost too much to process. "You think a marriage is going to change me?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with disbelief. Arthur rose from his chair and walked around the desk, coming to stand in front of his son. He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, though the gesture lacked any warmth. "You don't need to change for her, Lucas," he said, looking his son directly in the eyes. "You need to change for yourself, because right now, the path you're on leads to nowhere." There was a finality to Arthur's tone, a sense that this was indeed the last chance he was offering his son. And Lucas, despite his anger, couldn't entirely dismiss the truth in his father's words. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The resentment still burned, and a part of him wondered if this was just another way for Arthur to assert control, to prove that even as a grown man, Lucas was still bound by his father's will. "Fine," Lucas muttered at last, his jaw tightening as he made the decision. "If this is what you want, I'll go through with it. But don't expect me to thank you for it." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Arthur watched him go, his expression unchanging. He knew this battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for now, he had taken the first step in forcing Lucas to confront his own failings. Whether the marriage would indeed fix anything remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The game was now in motion, and there was no turning back. As Lucas left the building, his thoughts churned with disbelief and indignation. Married to a truck driver from Vermont? It was absurd, a scenario ripped straight from a bad television drama. But behind the defiance, there was a lingering sense of fear that maybe, just maybe, his father was right about him. And that was a possibility Lucas wasn't ready to face. He walked out into the night, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions, not yet aware that this improbable proposal would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. Just a few days later, Lucas found himself standing on a narrow dirt road in Vermont, staring at a small house that was worlds apart from the opulence he was used to. The house's chipped paint and rickety wooden fence spoke of years of wear and tear, a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers and polished surfaces he had known all his life. It wasn't just the appearance of the place that unsettled him. It was the realization that this was where he was expected to start a new chapter, a chapter he never wanted. As Lucas took a hesitant step closer, the front door creaked open. A woman stepped out onto the porch, her posture confident, though the way she crossed her arms over her chest suggested she wasn't exactly thrilled to see him. She had her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, wore faded jeans and scuffed-up boots that looked like they had been through countless rough days. There was an ease to the way she carried herself, a kind of natural strength that instantly set her apart from the polished, high-society women Lucas was accustomed to. "Lucas King?" she asked, her tone flat and tinged with skepticism, as though she was half expecting him to turn around and leave. "So, you're the fiancé?" Lucas managed a strained smile, but it came off as awkward, even to him. "Looks like it," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Amber's eyes raked over him, assessing. There was no sign of surprise in her expression, only a detached curiosity. If she was impressed or intimidated by his designer clothes or the expensive watch on his wrist, she gave no indication. Instead, she shrugged, her demeanor all business. "Well, I suppose you'd better come in. There's a lot to get done, and I don't have time to waste." Lucas felt a pang of irritation mixed with unease. Her bluntness caught him off guard. There was no polite small talk, no effort to make him feel welcome. She turned and walked back into the house, and he found himself following her, feeling strangely like an intruder. As he stepped inside, the interior was just as modest as the outside. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the faint smell of wood and earth lingered in the air. Everything had a worn-in, lived-in quality, nothing like the sterile luxury he was used to. Amber wasted no time in showing him around. "Over there's the kitchen. You'll be using it too, so don't expect me to cook for you," she said, her tone matter-of-fact as she gestured to the small, cramped space. She walked briskly, forcing Lucas to keep up with her pace. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall. The spare room is yours. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping outside." Lucas took in his surroundings as she spoke, trying to picture himself living there, even temporarily. It felt absurd. He glanced at her as she led him down a narrow corridor. "So, how exactly did you get roped into this?" he asked, his voice edged with the frustration he was trying to suppress. "I assume you didn't volunteer." Amber glanced over her shoulder at him, a faint hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Nope, but your father made a convincing offer. I needed help keeping this place afloat. Turns out, marrying some spoiled city boy was part of the deal." She paused at the doorway to the spare room and looked directly at him, her eyes sharp. "But don't worry, I'm not expecting a Prince Charming, just someone who's willing to work." Lucas bristled at the jab. "I'm not useless, you know," he shot back, though the defensiveness in his voice betrayed his insecurity. "I'm perfectly capable of doing things." Amber arched an eyebrow. "Is that right?" She stepped back, letting him enter the room. "Then I guess we'll find out soon enough." The spare room was small and sparsely furnished. Just a bed, a nightstand, and an old dresser with a cracked mirror. Lucas set his bag down, the reality of his situation settling in with a heavy weight. This was where he would live, at least for the foreseeable future. And there would be no escaping the fact that out here, he was far outside his element. As if sensing his discomfort, Amber leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms again. "Look, I don't know what you were expecting, but I don't have time to babysit you. There's real work to be done here, and I'm not going to slow down because you're figuring things out." Lucas looked up at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't trying to be cruel, just brutally honest. It was clear she had no intention of making this transition easy for him. It was up to him to adapt or fail. He swallowed, forcing himself to sound more confident than he felt. "Fine. So, what's first?" A faint, humorless smile appeared on Amber's face, as if she were amused by his attempt at bravado. "You'll start with the basics," she said, pushing off in the doorframe and gesturing for him to follow her back outside. "The barn needs cleaning, the fences need mending, and the truck could use a new set of tires. You're not going to learn anything by sitting around." Lucas followed her out to the barn, where the sharp scent of hay and manure greeted him. He recoiled slightly, then quickly tried to mask his discomfort, but Amber noticed. "You'd better get used to that," she said, handing him a pitchfork. "The animals don't care about your designer shoes. He hesitated for a moment before taking the pitchfork, feeling the roughness of the wooden handle in his hand. He glanced down at his leather shoes, then back at Amber. "You could have warned me to bring different clothes." Amber shrugged. "Figured you'd learn faster this way." As Lucas began the awkward task of shoveling hay, he could feel her watching him, not out of concern, but as if she were judging just how long he would last. His muscles strained with the unfamiliar movements, sweat forming on his brow, but he pushed through, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped, leaning on the pitchfork to catch his breath. "I'm assuming this isn't all there is to life on a farm," he panted, a half-hearted attempt at humor. Amber's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "This is just a start. There's a lot more to come. But if you think you can handle it, we'll see how you do tomorrow." As the day drew to a close, Lucas found himself collapsing onto the bed in the small spare room, his body aching from the labor. The luxury he had once taken for granted felt like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of his new surroundings. But somewhere amid the exhaustion, a spark of determination began to form, a desire to prove himself. Even if it was just to show Amber he wasn't the spoiled brat she assumed him to be. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow, he would do better. The first days were nothing short of a nightmare for Lucas. Every task felt like an insurmountable challenge, testing not only his physical strength but his resolve. Amber didn't make it easy on him, and Lucas suspected she had no intention of doing so. There were no breaks, no words of encouragement. Only instructions barked out as if he were a farmhand rather than the man she was supposed to marry. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Amber handed him a shovel and pointed to a massive pile of hay in the barn. "You're going to learn what hard work really means," she said, her tone firm and unyielding. "And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll learn a thing or two about yourself in the process." The look on her face made it clear she wasn't interested in hearing his excuses, so Lucas grabbed the shovel and approached the task. But within minutes, it became apparent just how grueling the work was. Each scoop of hay felt like a battle, and he struggled to maintain his grip as sweat soaked through his shirt. His muscles ached in ways he had never experienced, the physical strain forcing him to confront just how unprepared he was for this life. With every failed attempt, every moment where the hay seemed to mock his weakness, a fresh wave of frustration hit him. He glanced over his shoulder to see if Amber was watching, and there she was, standing at the barn's entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Is this some kind of test?" he called out, his voice laced with bitterness. "You just going to stand there and see how long it takes me to quit?" Amber walked over slowly, her boots crunching against the barn floor. "If it were a test, you'd already be failing," she replied calmly. "This isn't about whether you can move a pile of hay. It's about whether you'll keep going even when it feels impossible." Lucas tightened his grip on the shovel. "So, what? You think this is going to magically turn me into some kind of hard-working farm guy?" He snapped, his pride stinging more than his arms. She met his gaze with a level stare. "No," she said, "but it'll show me whether or not you have any fight in you." The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and bruises. The tasks never got any easier, and each morning brought a new struggle. Lucas found himself tending to animals, fixing fences, and hauling supplies until his hands were covered in blisters. There were moments when he wanted to drop everything and walk away, to escape back to a life where comfort and privilege were his constant companions. But each time that urge crept up, something in Amber's voice or the unspoken challenge in her eyes held him back. He began to notice her watching him more closely, though she rarely said anything beyond what was necessary to get the work done. Still, There were times when he'd catch her expression softening for just a moment, as if she saw something in him worth hoping for. One evening, after a particularly brutal day that included chasing down a stubborn goat and fixing a leak in the barn's roof, Lucas collapsed onto the old sofa in the living room, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, trying to steady his breath. The familiar sound of Amber's footsteps approached, and he opened his eyes just as she sat down beside him. "You're a long way from being a farmer," she remarked, her voice devoid of any malice or mockery. "But I'll give you credit. You're trying." He let out a breath that was halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "Trying? I'm here because my father forced me to be. If I had any say in the matter, I'd be 1,000 miles from here." His frustration spilled over, not just with the situation, but with himself for being so unfit for the life he had been thrust into. Amber gave a small nod, as though she had anticipated his response. "Then prove to yourself that you're not just your father's puppet," she said simply. "You don't have to be here for him. Stay for your own reasons." The words hung in the air, their meaning settling slowly into Lucas's consciousness. For so long, his life had been defined by his father's expectations, shaped by what Arthur King believed success to be. Now, in this quiet farmhouse with its peeling paint and creaking floorboards, Lucas was confronted with the stark reality of what it meant to truly build something for oneself. The thought unsettled him, but it also stirred something else, a faint, almost reluctant curiosity about who he could become if he kept at it. The next morning, Lucas was up before Amber, already outside with the shovel in hand. He attacked the day's task with a newfound resolve. Even if it was clumsy and uneven, he struggled, cursed under his breath, and often fumbled through the simplest of chores, but he persisted. When Amber came out and saw him working on his own, she didn't say anything, but he noticed the briefest flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. Later that day, while they were repairing a broken fence, Amber glanced over at him as he wrestled with a stubborn piece of wire. "You know," she said, "most people in your position would have quit by now." Lucas didn't look up, his hands occupied with twisting the wire into place. "Well, I'm not most people," he muttered, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Clearly," Amber replied, her tone not quite approving, but not dismissive either. There was a pause, and then she added, "You could have gone home after the first day. No one would have blamed you." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, the question in his mind finally finding its way to his lips. "Why do you care if I stay or not? It's not like you asked for this arrangement any more than I did." She met his gaze evenly. "Because, for better or worse, you're here now. And if you're going to be a part of this, I want to know if I can rely on you. Out here, there's no room for half-hearted efforts." Lucas didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure he could promise reliability, not yet. But her words struck a chord. For the first time, he realized that earning Amber's respect might be the key to finding something of value in this place. It wasn't just about proving his father wrong anymore. It was about proving to Amber, and maybe even to himself, that he was more than just a spoiled kid. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Lucas felt a different kind of exhaustion settle in. It was the kind that came from a day of honest labor, a feeling of having fought through something tangible. For the first time, he understood what Amber had meant about learning something about himself. There was a strange sense of accomplishment in the blisters on his hands and the ache in his muscles. He glanced at Amber as she put away the tools, her silhouette framed against the fading light. There was still a long way to go, and a part of him doubted if he would ever fully adapt to this life. But as he headed back towards the house, he resolved to give it another day, and then another after that. He wasn't sure if that meant he was beginning to change or simply becoming too stubborn to back down. Either way, the work continued, and so did he. As the days stretched on, Lucas started to see beyond the sharpness in Amber's tone, catching glimpses of something deeper. There was a heaviness there, as if she was carrying a burden that went beyond the daily grind. It wasn't just in the way she spoke, but in her silence too, in the moments where she would stare off into the distance, her thoughts seemingly miles away from the farm. One night, after an exhausting day spent fixing a section of the barn's roof, Lucas and Amber sat together on the porch. They passed a bottle of beer back and forth, each sip easing the tension of muscles worn out from labor. For a while, they just sat there, neither of them saying much, the quiet between them both familiar and foreign. It was a kind of silence Lucas wasn't used to, one that didn't demand to be filled. He glanced at Amber as she leaned back in the old wooden chair, her gaze lost in the darkness that lay beyond the porch light's reach. It was the way her shoulders seemed to slump a little, the way her eyes seemed to be seeing something that wasn't there, that pushed him to finally break the silence. "Why do you still live here?" he asked, keeping his voice low, almost as if he wasn't sure he should be asking. "I mean, this doesn't seem like the kind of life anyone would choose, not if they had other options." Amber's expression tightened, her jaw clenching slightly. She kept her eyes on the horizon, as though the answer lay somewhere out there. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight to it. "This farm belonged to my father. He built it up from nothing, put everything he had into this land. It was his life's work. When he died, I made a promise to keep it going. I wasn't about to let all his years of work just fall apart." The honesty in her words struck Lucas harder than he expected. He had assumed the farm was just a part of her background, not the cornerstone of her existence. He had never thought about what it must be like to inherit not just a piece of land, but someone else's dreams and sacrifices. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Amber continued, her voice growing softer, as if she was speaking more to herself than to him. "He never made much money from it, not like other people did, but he took pride in knowing he'd built something real with his own hands." She glanced at Lucas then, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. "I owed it to him to try and keep it going, even if it's just by the skin of my teeth." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. There was a knot forming in his chest, a mix of guilt and a newfound respect. "I didn't know," he admitted quietly. I guess I just thought you were doing this because you didn't have anywhere else to go." Amber let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I could have left. Trust me, I thought about it more times than I can count. I even did, once, packed a bag and made it all the way to the highway. But I couldn't go through with it. I kept thinking about how he used to say that the land was part of our blood. It sounds stupid, but it just felt like walking away would mean giving up on him." There was a bitterness in her voice that Lucas hadn't heard before, a kind of resignation that spoke of years of quiet sacrifice. He realized now how much Amber had kept hidden behind her tough exterior, how much she had borne alone. It occurred to him that maybe this farm wasn't just a burden she carried. It was a connection to a man she wasn't ready to let go of. "Sounds like he meant a lot to you," Lucas said, trying to bridge the gap that still hung between them. He was surprised at how personal the conversation had become, and a part of him felt like he was intruding. Amber nodded slowly. He was stubborn, set in his ways, and didn't believe in shortcuts. "I used to hate how hard he'd push me to keep up, but I think he just wanted to make sure I could handle things on my own if it ever came to that." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Lucas found himself reflecting on his own relationship with his father. Arthur King had always pushed him to, but not to prepare him for life's challenges. It had been more about control, about shaping him into the image Arthur wanted. This felt different. There was love in the kind of push Amber described, a hard-earned respect that came from working side by side with someone who believed in the value of what they were building. He took another swig from the bottle and handed it back to her. "So, you've just been holding on ever since?" he asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand what kept her here, fighting a battle that seemed to have no end. "Pretty much," Amber said, taking a long drink before setting the bottle down. "It hasn't been easy. There have been times I didn't know if I'd make it through another season. But every time I thought about giving up, I'd remember that look in his eyes when he talked about this place. It was like there was nothing else in the world that mattered to him." She shook her head. "So, I kept going." Lucas was quiet, feeling the gravity of her words settle into him. The more she spoke, the more he realized how much he had underestimated her. He had arrived on the farm assuming Amber was just someone stubbornly clinging to a piece of land out of sheer pride. But now, he saw that it was far more complicated than that. She was holding on to a promise, to a memory, to a sense of duty that went beyond reason. "Guess that explains why you don't take it easy on me," he said, his tone lighter, hoping to break the tension. "You're just keeping up the family tradition of hard labor." A small smile tugged at Amber's lips, the first real sign of warmth he'd seen from her. "I don't take it easy on you because I need to know if you're going to stick around or not. I've had plenty of people say they'd help out, only to bail when things got tough." He met her gaze then, a look of determination in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. Amber's smile faded, replaced by a look that was almost wary. "We'll see about that," she replied, standing up and brushing the dust off her jeans. "Talk is cheap, Lucas. You're going to have to prove it." As she walked back inside, Lucas sat there for a moment longer, his mind turning over everything she had shared. There was a part of him that wanted to promise her that he'd help save the farm, to find some way to ease the weight she was carrying. But he wasn't sure if she'd believe him, and truthfully, he wasn't sure if he was capable of following through. He had never been tested like this before, but as he got up from the porch, something had shifted inside him. It wasn't just about proving Amber wrong, or even proving himself to his father anymore. It was about something more, about finding out what kind of man he could be when there was no one around to bail him out. With each day that passed, he was beginning to understand that the work was never just about the farm. It was about the people tied to it, the histories written into its soil. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to become a part of that story too. Arthur's arrival at the farm was as sudden as it was unwelcome. There was no call, no warning, just the unmistakable gleam of his luxury car pulling up the dirt driveway, a stark contrast to the worn-out surroundings. The tension that gripped Lucas the moment he saw his father step out of the car was a familiar one, a reminder of the pressure and expectations that had always weighed on him. It felt like a heavy chain being dragged back around his neck. Arthur King emerged from the sleek vehicle in his tailored suit, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. His eyes moved slowly over the farm, taking in the dilapidated barn, the chipped paint on the house, the makeshift repairs scattered everywhere. There was no hiding the farm's imperfections, and Lucas didn't try to. He stood his ground, watching his father with a mixture of resentment and unease as the man's expression settled into one of clear disgust. "Well," Arthur said, his tone laced with disappointment as he took another long look around. "I trust you've learned your lesson by now, Lucas. It's time to come back where you belong. Enough of this nonsense." Lucas felt his jaw tighten, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," he replied, his voice steady even as a familiar fear of his father's judgment tried to creep in. "I'm staying right here." Arthur's eyes narrowed, a faint, condescending smile curving his lips. "Here," he repeated, gesturing with one hand toward the property. "This is what you're calling a life now. Look at this place, Lucas. It's a ruin, a goddamn wreck." He took a step closer, his gaze boring into his son's. "You're wasting your time. You're better than this." Lucas stood firm, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. "Better than what, exactly?" "Better than hard work. Better than doing something real. Something that doesn't involve chasing another deal or climbing some imaginary ladder." He shook his head, the frustration in his voice giving way to something closer to defiance. "Maybe I'm exactly where I belong." Arthur's face hardened, the faint smirk vanishing. "You don't belong in a place like this," he said sharply. "You're a king, Lucas. We build empires, we don't." He gestured dismissively toward the farm, his disdain palpable. "Wallow in dirt and decay. Empires," Lucas echoed bitterly. "You mean the kind built on people like Amber, who spend their whole lives trying to keep their heads above water while you sit in a boardroom, making decisions that change other people's lives without ever getting your hands dirty." He took a step closer to his father, his voice rising. "What's the point of all that if it means nothing in the end? If you don't even know what it's like to earn something with your own two hands?" For a brief moment, Arthur's composure wavered, his eyes flickering with a hint of something, surprise, perhaps, or even anger. It was as if Lucas had crossed a line, spoken a truth that neither of them had ever dared to acknowledge. But then Arthur's expression hardened again, the steel in his gaze returning. "So, this is what it's come to," he said, his voice low and cold. "You think digging in the dirt is going to make you a better man? You think staying here with her is some kind of solution? Her name is Amber," Lucas shot back, "and she's done more for me in a few months than you ever did." The words came out sharper than he intended, fueled by months of pent-up resentment. "At least here, I'm doing something that matters. I'm learning how to survive without you holding everything over my head." Arthur's eyes darkened, his tone turning harsh. "Learning to survive?" he scoffed. "You've had everything handed to you your entire life, Lucas. Don't pretend that living on this rundown farm is suddenly going to change that." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You're playing a game you don't understand, and when you get tired of it, when it becomes too hard, you'll come running back. You always do." The sting of those words dug deep, but Lucas refused to let it show. "Not this time," he said quietly, his voice unwavering. "I'm not going back, Dad. Not because it's hard, and not because you don't approve. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm staying because for once, I've found something real. Something that isn't about living up to your expectations." Arthur's expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. It was as if the son standing before him was a stranger, someone he had never truly known, or perhaps never bothered to understand. "And you think this life is going to give you what you need?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You're throwing away everything I've built for you, everything I've taught you for this?" He gestured broadly at the farm, his disdain clear. "It's not about throwing anything away," Lucas replied, his voice growing stronger. "It's about building something for myself. It's about proving that I'm not just a product of your decisions, not just an extension of your success." He paused, his gaze steady on his father's. "You don't get to decide what my life is worth." For a long moment, Arthur said nothing. He just stared at his son, the realization settling in that there would be no changing Lucas's mind. Finally, he straightened, smoothing out the lapels of his suit as if dusting off the confrontation. "Very well," he said. his voice regaining its usual coldness. "Stay here if that's what you want. But don't expect me to come running when this all falls apart. I won't be here to clean up your mess." "I don't need you to," Lucas answered. "I never did." Arthur turned and walked back to his car, his steps measured and deliberate, as if he were walking away from a failed business deal rather than his own son. Lucas watched as the car sped off, a plume of dust trailing behind it, and a strange mixture of relief and sadness washed over him. There had been no grand reconciliation, no moment of understanding. Just the same distance that had always existed between them, now laid bare. As the noise of the engine faded, Lucas felt the tension slowly ease from his shoulders. He turned to see Amber standing at the edge of the barn, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She hadn't interfered during the confrontation, and he was grateful for that. It was a battle that had been his alone to fight. She walked over, her eyes meeting his. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Stand up to him like that. He's still your father." Lucas shook his head. "It had to be done. I needed him to understand that I'm not just going to fall in line." He took a deep breath, still feeling the sting of his father's words, but also a sense of liberation. "Besides, if I'm going to make this work, if I'm really going to stay, I have to start living my own life, not his." Amber nodded slowly, a hint of approval in her gaze. "Well," she said, a small, almost reluctant smile forming on her lips, "if you're serious about sticking around, there's still a lot of work to be done." Lucas glanced back at the farm, taking in the imperfections his father had so easily dismissed. For the first time, he saw them not as signs of failure, but as challenges waiting to be met. "Then let's get to it," he said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. As they walked back toward the barn, side by side, Lucas felt a shift within himself. This place was far from perfect, and the road ahead was uncertain. But he was finally starting to believe that, with Amber by his side and his own two hands, he could build something worthwhile here, something that was his alone. After his confrontation with Arthur, Lucas found himself drawn to Amber's quiet resilience in a way he hadn't been before. He saw her differently now, not just as a woman who had begrudgingly agreed to marry him under impossible circumstances, but as someone who carried the weight of her own struggles with a kind of dignity that didn't demand recognition. His curiosity about her life began to grow, and with it, a desire to understand more about the burdens she bore. It started with small questions, casual enough, or so he thought. "How long have you been running the place by yourself?" he asked one evening while they worked side by side, repairing a fence post that had given way. "Since my father passed," Amber replied, her tone even, though there was a hint of something deeper. She hammered the last nail into place, not looking at him. "It's been about 3 years. The answer lingered in the air, and for a moment, Lucas didn't press further. But as the days went on, he kept noticing signs of the strain she was under. He saw it in the way her eyes would sometimes glaze over, staring off into some memory only she could see, and in the exhaustion that seemed to follow her around like a shadow, no matter how much sleep she managed to get. Eventually, he realized that if he wanted to understand her, he'd need to go beyond just watching and listening. One night, after a long day of clearing debris from the fields, Lucas sat down across from Amber at the kitchen table. She was going through a pile of bills, her expression set in a weary grimace. "It's bad, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. Amber glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you think?" she replied, her voice carrying an edge. "I'm just trying to keep my head above water." Lucas didn't back down. "What kind of debts are we talking about?" he asked gently. "It's obviously more than just a few late payments." Amber sighed, leaning back in her chair. For a moment, It seemed like she was going to brush him off, but then something shifted in her gaze. "The farm was already in trouble before my father died," she admitted. "He'd taken out loans to cover some bad years, a drought, a bad crop season, things like that. But when he passed, it all landed on me. I've been fighting to keep up ever since." The words hung heavily in the room, and Lucas felt a pang of guilt for not realizing sooner just how deep Amber's struggles went. He'd seen her working tirelessly, pushing herself beyond what seemed reasonable, but he had never understood the full picture. "So, you've been doing this alone the whole time?" he asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. Amber gave a small, bitter laugh. "Who else was there? I've had some help now and then, a few farmhands who came and went, but no one stays when things get tough. No one ever does." Lucas swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. "Why didn't you, I don't know, sell some of the land or find a partner to share the load?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, a flash of defiance sparking in them. "Sell the land?" she repeated, as if the very idea was an insult. "This place isn't just some business. It's my father's legacy. It's the only thing I have left of him." She paused, her voice softening. He wanted this place to thrive, not be torn apart and sold piece by piece. "I owe it to him to try." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her confession. Lucas didn't know what to say. He felt an urge to offer some kind of comfort, but he sensed that words wouldn't be enough. The realization hit him then. Amber had been carrying this burden long before he ever showed up, and no matter how hard he tried to understand it, he could never fully grasp what it meant to her. But he wanted to try. For the first time, Lucas felt a genuine need to help. Not because it was expected of him, or because it might prove something to his father, but because he couldn't bear to watch Amber fight this battle alone any longer. In the days that followed, Lucas started paying closer attention to the farm's financial situation. He asked more questions, listened carefully to the answers she gave, and even went through some of the old receipts and loan documents she kept in a drawer that never quite closed properly. It was worse than he had imagined. The debt was overwhelming, with interest that compounded mercilessly month after month. He found himself lingering in the barn one evening, staring at a pile of broken tools that hadn't been replaced in years. Amber walked in, stopping short when she saw the look on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag. Lucas turned to face her, frustration and determination battling for dominance in his expression. "We need to do something about the debt, Amber. There has to be a way to get some breathing room. At least." Amber crossed her arms, the hint of a scowl forming on her face. "And what exactly do you propose?" she challenged. "You think I haven't thought of every option? I've been fighting this fight since you were off living your high life." He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I'm not saying you haven't done enough, but maybe there's another way. We could talk to the bank, try to renegotiate the terms, or look for a buyer for some of the old equipment we don't use anymore." Amber's scowl deepened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or just a weary kind of acceptance. "And if they say no, what then?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Then we figure it out," Lucas said, his tone resolute. "But I'm not letting you do this alone anymore." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity behind his words. "Why do you even care?" she asked finally. "You don't owe me anything, Lucas. You don't owe this farm anything." He hesitated, unsure how to put what he was feeling into words. "Because I want to help," he said at last, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Because for once, I'm actually doing something that matters to me, and I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose this." His gaze locked with hers, and there was no mistaking the intensity of his meaning. Amber looked away, swallowing hard. "This farm breaks people," she said softly. "It'll take everything you have and still demand more." "Then let it," Lucas replied. "I'm not scared of hard work. Not anymore." There was a pause. Then Amber nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "We'll give it a shot. But if this all falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Lucas nodded. Feeling a sense of determination surge through him. This wasn't just about proving something to his father anymore. It wasn't even about proving something to himself. It was about Amber, about the land, about the future that suddenly seemed worth fighting for. He wasn't entirely sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in his life, Lucas felt like he was on the right one. The tension between Lucas and Amber had been building for days, an undercurrent of unspoken words and half-finished thoughts. They had been working together more closely than ever, tackling the farm's issues side by side, and there was a familiarity growing between them, a quiet comfort that Lucas had come to look forward to. But there was also a weight pressing down on him, a truth he had avoided sharing. It all came to a head late one afternoon as they stood in the barn, discussing repairs. Amber had just mentioned a neighbor who might have a used tractor for sale when Lucas, caught off guard by a surge of guilt, blurted out, "I need to tell you something." Amber turned, her brow furrowing at the tone of his voice. "What is it?" she asked, already sensing that it wasn't just about farm business. He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "The reason I came here," he began, his voice low, "it wasn't exactly my choice. My father, he made me. This whole marriage idea, it was his plan, not mine." The words seemed to land like a physical blow. Amber took a step back, her face hardening as the realization sank in. "What are you saying?" she demanded, her voice rising. "That this was just some kind of deal? That you came here because he told you to, not because you actually wanted to help?" "It's not like that," Lucas said quickly, trying to close the distance between them. "At first, yeah, I didn't want to be here. It was all about getting out from under my father's thumb. But things changed. I changed." Amber's eyes flashed with anger, and she took another step back, crossing her arms over her chest as if to create a barrier between them. "So, what am I then?" she snapped. "Just a piece of the deal? A pawn in your father's sick game to teach you some kind of twisted lesson?" "That's not what this is," Lucas insisted, his voice desperate now. I didn't even know you, didn't know anything about this place. But now it's different. I've come to care about the farm. About what, Lucas?" Amber cut him off, her tone sharp and accusing. "About me? Because I don't see how you could possibly care about me when you've been lying to me this entire time." "I wasn't lying," he argued, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I just didn't know how to tell you. I was trying to prove that I could stay, that I could be someone you could count on." Amber shook her head, her expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "And when exactly were you planning to tell me the truth?" she asked coldly. "Or were you just going to let me keep thinking you showed up here out of your own free will, like you actually wanted to be a part of this life?" Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. What could he say? That he hadn't thought that far ahead? That a part of him had hoped the truth wouldn't matter anymore once he had earned her trust? "I didn't want to hurt you," he said at last, his voice barely audible. Amber let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet barn. "Well, congratulations, Lucas. You failed at that." Her eyes bore into his, searching for any sign that he might truly understand the depth of her betrayal. "You were never really here, were you? Not in the way I thought. This whole time," You were just doing what your father told you to do. It wasn't just about him. Lucas shot back, frustration and regret mixing in his chest like a tangled knot. I stayed because I wanted to, because I didn't want to be the person my father thought I was, because I didn't want to let you down. She shook her head again, more slowly this time, the fight seeming to drain out of her. You never gave me a choice, Lucas, she said quietly. I thought you were here because you wanted to help save the farm, because you actually cared about keeping your word. But now I see you were just trying to save yourself. The words hit Lucas harder than he expected. He wanted to deny them, to tell her she was wrong, that he had changed, that he was different now. But as he looked at her, standing there with her shoulders squared and her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain, he realized there was nothing he could say to fix this. Not now. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words sounding empty even as they left his mouth. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Amber turned away from him, her back rigid. That's the problem, Lucas, she said over her shoulder, her voice barely more than a murmur. You never meant for anything. You just let things happen. She started walking toward the barn door, her steps quick and determined, as though putting as much distance between them was the only solution she could think of. I don't have time for someone who can't even be honest about why they're here. As she walked out, Lucas felt the full weight of his mistake settle in. The barn suddenly felt emptier, colder, and the silence that followed her exit was the worst kind of punishment. He had feared this moment, had known on some level that the truth could shatter whatever fragile connection had been growing between them. But he had let it happen anyway, had let the lies stretch on because he hadn't known how to be honest without risking everything. Now, it seemed, he had lost her anyway. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door Amber had walked through, his mind replaying the look in her eyes. It wasn't just anger he had seen there. It was disappointment, a kind of wounded disbelief that he had never expected to see from her. And that was what hurt the most, knowing that he had let her down not by being the man his father wanted, but by failing to be the man he wanted to be. Finally, he turned back to the task they had been working on before the argument broke out. The fence was still broken, the tools scattered across the ground, as if mocking him for thinking he could repair something so easily. But now, as he picked up the hammer, there was no one to share the work with, no one to look over at and feel the quiet satisfaction of progress. It was just him and the silence. He swung the hammer against the post, again and again, each strike a release of the frustration that had built up inside him. But as he worked, the truth gnawed at him. It wasn't the fence that needed fixing. It was the damage he had caused with his own silence, his own fear. He had come to care about Amber and the farm more than he ever thought possible. But now, when it mattered most, he had proven himself unworthy of both. As he hammered away, he realized that if he wanted any chance of making things right, it would take more than apologies and explanations. It would take action, real commitment, and a willingness to rebuild what he had broken, if Amber would even give him the chance. The sound of the hammer echoed through the barn, mingling with the heavy weight of regret that hung in the air. Lucas didn't know how to fix what he had broken, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to walk away. Not now. Not when he had something real to fight for. Lucas couldn't shake the image of Amber walking away. The disappointment etched in her features. Her words haunted him, replaying in his mind as if daring him to prove her wrong. She had accused him of being dishonest, of never really committing, and as much as he hated to admit it, there was truth in what she'd said. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't erase the deception, but he was determined to find a way to make things right. He spent hours that night going over the farm's finances, the stack of bills and loan statements Amber had tried to manage on her own. He saw the reality of the situation in black and white. The debt was crushing, and if something wasn't done soon, all of Amber's efforts to keep the place running would be for nothing. In that moment, Lucas made a decision. He had a personal savings account, money he had accumulated over the years, funds set aside by his father. The idea of using that money had always seemed like another way for his father to control him, to tie him to the life he had been trying to escape. But now, Lucas saw a different purpose for it. This wasn't about him or his father anymore. It was about saving the farm and giving Amber the chance she deserved. The next day, Lucas made the call to the bank. He paid off the outstanding debts in full, transferring a substantial sum from his personal funds to clear the loans. He knew it was risky, knew Amber wouldn't approve of him doing it without telling her first, but he didn't see another way. It was a leap of faith, something he hadn't taken in a long time. When Amber found out, it didn't take long for her to confront him. She stormed into the barn where he was working, her expression a mix of shock and fury. "What did you do, Lucas?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You think throwing money at the problem is going to fix it?" Lucas put down the wrench he'd been using, turning to face her. "I did what I had to do," he said calmly. "The debt was suffocating you, and I had the means to help. So, I did." Amber's eyes blazed with anger. "You went behind my back," she snapped. "You had no right to make that decision for me. Do you even understand what this place means? It's not just a number you can balance out." "I know it's more than that," Lucas replied, his voice steady despite the frustration in Amber's tone. "But I also know that if something didn't change, you would have lost it. I'm trying to help you, Amber. I'm trying to do something real for once." She shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "This is what you always do, isn't it?" she shot back. "You think you can solve everything with money because that's how it's always worked for you. But this farm isn't just a financial problem, Lucas. It's not something you can buy your way out of. It's not about buying my way out," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "It's about buying time. Time for us to figure things out without the bank breathing down our necks. I didn't do this to undermine you. I did it because I didn't want to see you lose everything your father worked for." Amber's expression softened, but only slightly. There was still a deep resentment there, a sense of betrayal that his actions had stirred up. "And what about what I've worked for?" she asked quietly. "I've been holding this place together, fighting every day to keep it alive. And now, you just come in and I'm trying to be part of that fight." Lucas interrupted, his tone firm. "You were right about me before. I wasn't really here at the beginning. I was just going through the motions, trying to prove a point to my father. But that's not why I stayed. I stayed because I found something here that I never found back there. I found a purpose. And I found you." Amber froze at his words, her anger wavering as a different emotion crept in. "And you think paying off the debt is going to fix everything between us?" she asked, her voice low. "No," Lucas admitted, stepping closer. "I know it's not, but I'm trying to fix myself, Amber. I'm trying to be the kind of person who does more than just talk. The kind of person who acts, who takes risks, who doesn't just walk away when things get hard. You once said this farm breaks people, that it demands more than you think you can give. I'm trying to give more." She studied him for a moment, her expression a mix of skepticism and something softer, almost reluctant hope. "And what happens when it demands more than you're willing to give?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I give more," he answered, without hesitation. "I'm not running away from this, Amber. Not from you and not from the farm. I'm here, and I'm staying, whether you like it or not." The barn was silent, save for the sound of their breathing. Amber looked down, as if weighing his words, her hands slowly unclenching at her sides. "I don't know if I can trust you, Lucas," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "You lied to me once. How do I know this isn't just another way for you to feel better about yourself?" "Because I'm not asking you to trust me yet," he said, his voice softening. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to earn it, to show you that I'm not the same person who showed up here months ago. You don't have to believe me right now. Just let me prove it." Amber let out a slow breath, lifting her gaze to meet his. "You better not mess this up," she said, a trace of a smile tugging at her lips despite the lingering hurt in her eyes. "Because if you do, I'll kick you off this farm myself." Lucas felt a surge of relief, mixed with the weight of the challenge he had set for himself. "Fair enough," he replied, a small smile crossing his own lips. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Amber turned to leave, Lucas watched her walk away, his determination solidifying. He knew it would take more than paying off debts to repair the rift between them, but he had taken the first step. Now, it was time to prove that he was capable of much more than just throwing money at problems. He was committed to earning her trust back, not with grand gestures, but with every hour of labor, every shared hardship, and every small act that showed he was there for the long haul. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, Lucas felt like he was on the right one. Now, he just had to keep walking it. Weeks passed in a strained silence. The tension between Amber and Lucas was palpable, a constant reminder of the unresolved issues that lay between them. Amber kept her distance, her words to him limited to brief exchanges about chores and repairs. Yet, she couldn't help but notice how Lucas had changed. He woke up early and worked late, tackling every task with a kind of steady determination that seemed unshakable. He didn't wait for her approval or acknowledgement. He just kept going, day after day, as if driven by something deeper than just the need to prove himself. Amber watched him from a distance at first, skeptical that his change was real, worried it was just a performance to win her back. But as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't deny that there was something different about him. He didn't complain, even when the work was grueling, even when things went wrong and tasks seemed impossible. It was as if the farm was slowly reshaping him, and she found herself wondering who this new Lucas was. One evening, as Lucas was repairing a fence post near the edge of the property, Amber approached him. She had been debating whether or not to confront him all day, but now, watching him work tirelessly, she decided it was time. There were too many questions, too many things left unsaid, and she needed answers. "Lucas," she called, her voice breaking the quiet of the evening. He looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes as he met her gaze. She hadn't spoken to him directly in what felt like forever. Amber took a breath, folding her arms across her chest. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with curiosity. "Even after I told you I didn't want you here, after everything that happened, why didn't you just leave?" Lucas set the hammer down, his gaze not wavering as he looked at her. There was a vulnerability in his expression that she hadn't seen before, as if the question had touched something raw inside him. "Because for the first time in my life, I found something worth fighting for," he said quietly, the words heavy with sincerity. "And I couldn't walk away from that." Amber felt a tightening in her chest at his response. There was no bravado in his voice, no trace of the arrogance she had come to expect from him when they first met. It was just an honest, simple truth, and it caught her off guard. She took a step closer, her gaze searching his face for any hint of deception. "You really expect me to believe that?" she asked, a trace of bitterness still clinging to her tone. "After all the lies, after everything you kept from me?" "I don't expect you to believe me," Lucas admitted, his voice steady. "But it's the truth. At first, I didn't know what I was doing here. I thought it was just about proving my father wrong, about not being a failure in his eyes. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than that. It became about you, about this farm, about finding out who I am when no one's watching." He could see the skepticism still lingering in her eyes, but there was also a softness there, as if she wanted to believe him even if she didn't quite trust herself to. "You say that now," she replied, "but what happens when things get hard again? What happens when you realize that this life isn't just some project you can fix up and walk away from? It's not a phase, Lucas. It's real, and it demands everything you have." "I know," Lucas said, taking a step toward her. "And I'm not going anywhere. I've already given more of myself to this place than I ever thought I could, and I'm willing to give even more if that's what it takes." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not the same person I was when I first got here, Amber. I know I messed up, I know I lied, but I'm trying to make it right. I'm trying to be the kind of person who doesn't run away when things get hard." Amber's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and something that resembled hope. She was silent for a long moment, as if weighing his words, considering whether to let her guard down even a little. "You're different, I'll give you that," she said finally, her voice softening just a fraction. "But change takes more than a few weeks of hard work. It takes time. It takes more than just words." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Lucas replied. "I'm asking for a chance to show you that I'm serious, that this is real for me." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't just fall in love with this farm, Amber. I fell in love with what it stands for, and with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything he had said before. Amber's breath caught in her throat at his admission. She had seen the effort he had put in, the quiet determination, the sacrifices he was willing to make, but she hadn't expected him to speak so openly about his feelings. It was as if he was laying everything on the line, without any guarantee that she would give him what he was looking for in return. She took a step back, needing space to think, to process what he was saying. "I don't know if I can give you what you're asking for," she said quietly. "There's too much that's happened, too much that's been broken." "I know," Lucas replied, his voice gentle but unwavering. "And I don't expect you to decide right now. All I'm asking is that you let me keep trying. Let me keep proving myself, one day at a time. If, at the end of it all, you still don't think I belong here, then I'll leave. But not until I've given it everything I have." Amber's eyes met his, and for the first time in weeks, there was no anger, no disappointment, just a kind of cautious understanding. "You better not give me a reason to regret this," she said, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her lips. "Because if you do, I won't hesitate to remind you how much of a mistake it was." A slow, relieved smile spread across Lucas's face. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you," he said, and there was a quiet warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. He knew that this was only the beginning of what would be a long road toward redemption, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking that road with a purpose, with a reason to keep going no matter how rough the terrain became. As Amber turned to head back to the house, Lucas watched her go, a feeling of determination welling up inside him. He had made his decision, and he was prepared to face whatever came next. There would still be challenges ahead, struggles that would test him, but he was ready. For the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to fight for something real. In the months that followed, Lucas and Amber found themselves in a slow, tentative dance of rebuilding. The awkwardness of trying to mend what was broken slowly gave way to a rhythm that felt more natural, more honest. They talked more openly, sharing not just plans for the farm but their fears, their hopes, and even their past in a way they hadn't dared to before. It was as if they were meeting each other for the first time, with all the walls stripped away. Lucas had asked Amber for a second chance, a chance to start over, to build something real between them without the pressure of his father's expectations or the burdens of the past hanging over their heads. He wanted it to be just them, working together to forge a future they could both believe in. Amber had hesitated, her trust in him had been fractured, and she wasn't about to give her heart away so easily again. But in his eyes, she saw a sincerity that was hard to ignore, a resolve that had not been there when he first arrived. So, cautiously, she agreed. The decision didn't change things overnight. There were still hard days, still moments when Amber doubted whether Lucas would stay the course, whether this life was something he could truly commit to. But every time those doubts surfaced, Lucas showed up. He was there at dawn to feed the animals, there in the evening to mend whatever needed fixing. It wasn't just a physical labor. It was his presence, his quiet determination that spoke louder than any promise. As the weeks turned into months, the farm itself began to reflect the shift. Where there had once been disrepair and decay, there was now slow but steady progress. The barn was patched up, the fences repaired, and the fields began to flourish again. They worked side by side, falling into a comfortable rhythm, each instinctively knowing where the other would be, what needed to be done. There was a closeness between them that didn't need to be spoken, a bond that had been forged through struggle and perseverance. One night, after a long day of work, Lucas and Amber found themselves sitting together on the porch. It was a habit they'd fallen into, ending the day there, letting the silence settle around them, the weight of the day's efforts slowly lifting off their shoulders. As they sat side by side, Lucas glanced over at Amber, who was staring off into the distance, her expression thoughtful. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar flutter of uncertainty in his chest. "Amber," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I know we've come a long way, but I need to know. Do you really see me as part of this? Of your life here? Or am I still just proving myself?" Amber turned to look at him, the corner of her mouth curling into a small, almost wistful smile. "You've proven more than I ever expected, Lucas," she said. "And honestly, I don't know when it happened exactly, but somewhere along the way, I stopped wondering if you'd leave. I started believing you were here to stay." He felt a weight lift off his chest at her words, but there was still more he needed to say. "I don't want this to just be about me making up for the past," he confessed. "I want us to build something new, something that's ours, something we both choose, not because we have to, but because we want to." Amber's gaze softened and she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "Then let's choose it," she said quietly. "Let's choose each other, Lucas. Not because it's easy, and not because we're trying to prove anything, but because, in the end, we decided that this is where we belong." He felt a surge of warmth at her words, a sense of relief and hope mixed together in a way that felt almost overwhelming. Without a word, he took her hand in his, squeezing it gently, and they sat in silence once more, not needing to fill the space between them with anything other than the simple truth of being there, together. As the night wore on, Lucas glanced up at the sky. The stars spread out above them in a quiet, endless expanse. "It's funny," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I spent so much of my life chasing what my father thought mattered, success, power, everything that came with being a king. But out here, none of that seems to matter anymore. It's like I found something worth more than all of that just in the quiet of this place. In you." Amber leaned her head back, letting his words settle into the quiet of the night. "It's not the kind of life you expect to choose," she replied, her voice low and steady. "But sometimes it's exactly the one you need." For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt completely at peace. The past no longer seemed like something to escape from, nor did the future feel like a daunting void. There was just the present, this moment with Amber, the farm, and the life they were carving out for themselves, one day at a time. He turned to her, a tender smile on his lips. "Amber, let's make this our home. Not just a place we work and live in, but a real home. Let's put down roots and see what happens." Amber looked back at him, the hint of a tear glistening in her eye, though her smile was unwavering. "I think we've already started," she whispered. And as they sat there, side by side, holding on each other, Lucas knew they had indeed found something real. It wasn't perfect, and it hadn't come easily, but it was theirs. In the end, they didn't need words to understand what had changed or to feel the quiet promise that lingered between them. They had chosen each other, chosen to fight for something deeper than pride or expectation. And in that choice, they had found not only redemption, but a love that was true and enduring, born from struggle and made all the stronger because of it.